Let's talk about vintage Ludwig drums, what happens when you put different heads on the toms, and I'm gonna even talk about one of the best snare drums they've ever made. Ringo played them, Bonham played them, and now I play them too. But this isn't just any old vintage Ludwig kit. These are some of the most prized shells used by session players, live players, and drum collectors alike. This kick drum and these couple toms have 3-ply maple poplar maple shells with a clear interior made in the early 70s in Chicago. And what makes them so special? Just listen to them. That kick drum just punches you in the gut. Despite that hurting, there's something so soft and pillowy about that tone. And those couple toms? These are some of the most musical toms I've ever played. And they inspire me in such a different way as compared to some of the older Ludwig drums from the 60s and even the WFL drums from the 50s. Now, that WFL kit from the 50s sounds awesome, but they're just so big. I can't imagine gigging with a 24-inch kick drum and a 13-inch tom and a 16-inch floor tom, trying to get that in and out of your car, trying to get that in and out of the bar, and then having to haul it back home afterwards. I mean, that's just too much. But this little green kit here, they're little and they're light. They're so easy to move in and out of the car. They're easy on the back when you lift them up. You just can't beat that. The problem is it's hard to put together a kit just like this. Oftentimes, if you find a 20-inch kick drum with 12 and 14-inch toms, it's gonna cost you a ton of money. I don't have that kind of money. I mean, look I'm living in a basement in Wisconsin. But one thing I have is a creative mind, so I put that to work. For many, many years, I wanted to put together a kit just like this. And at the Chicago Vintage Drum Show in 2022, it happened. I found this floor tom right here. And normally, that drum, just that drum in this market would cost you over $1,000 to buy. And I found it for less than half of that. But there was a reason. The wrap on this thing was the ugliest shade of silver sparkle you ever seen. It looked like caked on white sparkle, and it was disgusting. But that's okay, because as you can see, it's green now. So I took that thing home, and then I just had to find a kick drum and a rack tom. I found this 12-inch tom on eBay. I found this 20-inch kick drum in California with a Facebook friend, and this kick drum is pretty special right here. This was the most expensive drum out of all three, and the reason is because it doesn't have a hole in the middle here where you would normally have a post coming out for a couple tom-toms. This just has holes for a rail consolette. And because of that, it's more expensive, but it's more collectible. It should sound a little bit better because there's more wood there to resonate. I don't know how much truth there is in that, especially since I have the wrap covering any extra holes that are under there. But the other thing would be is if that center post was still there and cut, it would be releasing a lot more air and drying up the tone of the drum. But I want to dry up the tone of the drum through the port in the front of the kick head because that's where the mics are. So that's where I want that tone to go. So after I had these three drums together in their original state, I brought them up to Milwaukee to MKE Drum Co., where Derek Mance, a good buddy of mine, fixed everything up on these things. He cleaned up the bearing edges and shrewd them, meaning that he made them as round as he could again, and maintained the original bearing edge profile that Ludwig did on these in the 70s. So, in theory, they should sing just as well as they did when they came out of the factory. And they look just as good as they should have coming out of the factory, too. He cleaned up all the chrome on them, and most importantly, as far as visuals go, is this thing was rewrapped in green sparkle, which is sort of an homage to both Bonham and a close friend and former coworker of mine named Perry, who's a rockabilly drummer and a roots drummer, and I think we're gonna see some of his gear in a later video. But when it comes to this kit, they sound as good as they look. Now those tom heads that you heard there are going to be the EC2S frosted heads on the top by Evans, and then the G2 clear heads on the bottom. So basically a standard 2-ply head on the bottom, and on the top a pre-dampened head that's frosted, which sort of dries it out maybe 5 or 10%-ish. And that combination sounds really cool. You get sort of a good little modern thuddy thing out of some very vintage drums. So it's kind of the meeting of these sort of two worlds. But if you know anything about me, those aren't my normal tom heads. I use Evans Onyx. So let's switch out those EC2S and the G2 heads on the bottom for Evans Onyx on both sides of the toms. Now these heads, they sound a lot different. I don't know how to describe it, but tonally, they almost make these vintage drums sound more like what vintage drums sound like in my head. But if you really want to make these things sound like vintage drums, you gotta check out Roots EQ rings. These rings are so cool. They have a metal thing in the outside holding it down, a bunch of heavy cloth, and they just sit on your toms or your snare drum, and they basically curb a little bit of that high end and dampen the drums a little bit. And that tone sounds so good because what it does is it lets other elements in a musical arrangement shine, and your drums sit so much more nicely in a mix. All right, so that was kind of a showboaty clip, but let's hear how they sound with like a real normal drum part in a song. These little green drums are just so great. But I don't care if you're playing drums that are as old as your dad or your grandpa, or drums that are as new as having been built a few months ago. There are two different things I do care about though. One is that you play instruments that inspire you. And this kit here is so much fun to play at. It inspires me every time I hit them. The second part that I personally care about is having drums that are sort of like chameleons. I can change out the heads on the toms and get a different sound. I can add dampening to the toms or the kick, and then the drums sound like a completely different set in seconds. But when I switched out the heads earlier in this video, did you notice something else that was switched on the kit? I swapped out the snare drum. Now, the first drum that I used in the video was a prototype Ludwig, and you can get that from a shop that's local to me. All you gotta do is email me and I'll get you in contact with them. But this drum is mine. This is the treasured 14 by 6.5 inch Black Beauty by Ludwig. And when this came out in the 70s, it was a hit, and it's even more popular today. The same things that I love about this little green kit, I love about this snare drum too. Every time I hit this thing, I'm inspired. And you can change the heads on this thing and it'll sound like 1,000 different drums. This Evans UV2 sounds great for a classic rock snare drum tone. You can swap it out for the heavyweight head if you want something a little more modern, or try dampening techniques. Because once you start dampening this thing with one of those Roots EQ rings, it sounds even more different. Listen, this brass drum is one of my favorites. And if you're interested in hearing more brass, more aluminum, and more metal snare drums, check out my favorites in this video right here. I think you're gonna dig it. And until next time, be good.